On the morning of May 18, 1927, in the small farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, a school treasurer named Andrew Kehoe would orchestrate the deadliest school massacre in American history. 45 people would die that day, 38 of them children. Yet somehow, this catastrophe has been nearly erased from our collective memory, overshadowed by more recent tragedies and buried beneath almost a century of silence. Picture this, a peaceful spring morning in rural Michigan. Farmers tending their fields. Children walking to school with lunch pails in hand, their voices carrying across the countryside. The Bath Consolidated School stands proud in the center of the community, a modern, two-story brick building that represents everything progressive about 1920s America. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked, and where the most exciting news might be the harvest forecast or who's courting whom. But beneath this Norman Rockwell facade, something sinister was brewing. For months, Andrew Kehoe had been methodically wiring the school with dynamite. Every trip to the building as treasurer, every casual visit, every friendly wave to teachers and students, all while secretly placing explosives that would turn a symbol of hope into a tomb of horror. What drives a man to target children? What darkness festers in the human heart that can transform a respected community member into a mass murderer? The Bath School disaster isn't just about one morning of unspeakable violence. It's about the terrifying reality that evil can hide behind the most ordinary face, in the most ordinary place, planning the most extraordinary horror. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The year 1927 was supposed to be one of prosperity and progress. Charles Lindbergh had just completed his historic solo flight across the Atlantic. The economy was booming. America felt invincible, unstoppable, moving toward an even brighter future. But in Bath Township, Michigan, population 300, time was running out. A bomb was ticking. Not just the physical explosives Andrew Kehoe had planted, but the psychological time bomb of his own deteriorating mind. This is the story of how a tax dispute became a death sentence for dozens of innocent children. How financial stress became fatal obsession. How one man's personal failures became a community's unthinkable tragedy. And how America's deadliest school attack was committed not by a disturbed teenager or an outside terrorist, but by a trusted member of the community itself. A man who smiled at these children in the hallways while secretly planning their deaths. The morning of May 18th began like any other. But by noon, Bath Township would be forever changed, and America would confront a new kind of nightmare it was not prepared to understand. Bath Township in 1927 embodied everything Americans believed about their heartland. Rolling farmland stretched endlessly under vast Michigan skies, dotted with red barns and white farmhouses that seemed lifted from a postcard. This was corn country, dairy country, where families had worked the same soil for generations and measured success, not in stock portfolios, but in healthy livestock and bountiful harvests. The community of roughly 300 souls lived by rhythms as old as agriculture itself. Spring planting, summer cultivation, autumn harvest, winter preparation. Each season brought its own labors and its own rewards. Children grew up knowing every neighbor within a 5-mile radius, and those neighbors functioned as extended family. When someone needed help bringing in hay before a storm, dozens of hands appeared without being asked. When illness struck a household, casseroles materialized on kitchen tables as if by magic. At the heart of this community stood the Bath Consolidated School, a symbol of everything progressive and promising about rural America. Built in 1922 at a cost of $50,000, an enormous sum for a farming community, the two-story brick building represented the township's commitment to giving their children the best possible education. No more one-room schoolhouses, with wood-burning stoves and outdoor privies. This was modern education for the modern age. Electric lights, indoor plumbing, and enough space for all grades from kindergarten through 12th. The school served children from across the township's 36 square miles. Every morning, horse-drawn wagons and the occasional automobile converged on the building, carrying youngsters whose parents had made genuine sacrifices to provide this educational opportunity. Some families had mortgaged their farms to pay for the construction bonds. Others worked extra jobs in town to cover the increased taxes. But they believed, deeply, fervently, that education was the pathway to a better life for their children. Superintendent Emery Hike embodied these aspirations. A tall, dignified man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an unwavering belief in public education. Hike had transformed Bath from a collection of scattered rural schools into a unified educational system. He knew every child by name, understood every family's circumstances, and carried the weight of the community's trust with quiet pride. Parents respected him, children admired him, and fellow educators throughout Michigan sought his advice. The school day began at 8:30 sharp with the ringing of the large bell mounted in the building's tower. Students filed into classrooms filled with the latest textbooks and educational materials. The building hummed with the sounds of learning, recitations of multiplication tables, the scratching of chalk on blackboards, the rustle of pages turning in geography books that promised adventures in distant lands. But prosperity had brought unexpected complications to this pastoral paradise. The modern school required modern funding, and that meant higher property taxes than many farmers had ever imagined paying. What seemed reasonable during the boom years of the early 1920s felt crushing as agricultural prices began to decline. Some families found themselves choosing between keeping their farms and funding their children's education. In this pressure cooker of financial stress and community expectations, certain residents began to grumble. Town meetings grew heated. Neighbors who had once shared harvests now argued over tax assessments. The very symbol of Bath's progress, the magnificent school building, became a source of bitter division. And watching it all, serving as school treasurer, was Andrew Kehoe, a man whose resentments ran deeper than anyone realized, whose anger burned hotter than anyone suspected, and whose capacity for revenge would soon shatter this peaceful community forever. To his neighbors in Bath Township, Andrew Philip Kehoe appeared to be the ideal citizen, a successful farmer, devoted husband, and pillar of the community. At 45 years old, he cut an impressive figure, tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes and prematurely gray hair that gave him a distinguished appearance. His 185-acre farm on Slight Road was immaculately maintained, his barn painted bright red, his fences straight and true. Everything about Andrew Kehoe's external life suggested a man who had achieved the American dream. But like so many facades in small-town America, this one concealed troubling depths that no one bothered to explore. Born in 1872 in Tecumseh, Michigan, Kehoe had grown up on a farm, learning early that success required meticulous planning and relentless execution. His father, a stern German immigrant, had instilled in young Andrew an obsession with precision that would define his entire life. Every task had to be completed perfectly. Every detail had to be controlled. Failure was not merely disappointing, it was unacceptable. After completing his education, Kehoe had worked various jobs before purchasing his Bath Township farm in 1919. He married Ellen Nellie Price, a woman from a prosperous local family, and seemed to settle into the rhythm of rural life. Neighbors appreciated his mechanical skills. Kehoe could repair any engine, wire any building, fix any problem that required technical expertise. He served on the school board, managed the township's electrical systems, and earned a reputation as someone who got things done. Yet those who worked closely with Kehoe noticed unsettling patterns. His temper, when triggered, was volcanic and unpredictable. During school board meetings, he would fly into rages over minor budgetary items, his face flushing red as he pounded the table and demanded answers. Other board members learned to tread carefully around topics that might set him off, particularly anything involving the school's construction costs or property tax assessments. His marriage to Nellie painted an even darker picture. Neighbors occasionally noticed unexplained bruises on her arms, and her formerly outgoing personality had gradually withdrawn into quiet submission. She stopped attending church socials and rarely visited friends without Andrew's presence. When asked about her husband's temper, she would quickly change the subject, her eyes betraying a fear she dared not voice. Kehoe's relationship with children was particularly disturbing in retrospect. Unlike most farmers in the community, who welcomed neighborhood children to play in their barns or help with minor chores, Kehoe's property was strictly off-limits. He had posted no trespassing signs around his farm and would chase away any child who dared cross onto his land. When a neighbor's dog wandered onto his property, Kehoe beat the animal so severely that it had to be put down. His mechanical talents, which had once made him valuable to the community, began to take on an obsessive quality. Kehoe would spend hours in his workshop, tinkering with explosives for clearing stumps and rocks from farmland. He ordered chemicals and blasting materials far beyond what any normal farming operation required, claiming he was developing more efficient methods for land clearing. Neighbors assumed his experiments were simply another example of his perfectionist nature. Financial pressures had begun mounting on the Kehoe farm by the mid-1920s. Like many farmers, he had borrowed against future crop yields to fund improvements and expansion. When agricultural prices declined, those debts became crushing burdens. The magnificent school that had once symbolized community progress now represented hundreds of dollars in annual tax obligations that Kehoe could barely afford. But instead of seeking help or adjusting his expectations, Kehoe internalized his failures as personal humiliations. Every tax notice became a personal attack. Every school board meeting became a battlefield. Every interaction with Superintendent Hike became an opportunity to nurse grievances that were growing more poisonous by the day. As 1926 turned into 1927, Andrew Kehoe's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. His neighbors still saw the successful farmer and community leader, but underneath, something far more dangerous was taking shape. A mind consumed by resentment, a heart filled with hatred, and a plan that would soon turn their peaceful community into a scene of unimaginable horror. The transformation of Andrew Kehoe from respected community member to mass murderer didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn that began with numbers on a tax assessment and escalated into murderous obsession. By early 1926, the financial pressures crushing Kehoe's farm had become the singular focus of his deteriorating mind, and he had identified a convenient scapegoat: the Bath Consolidated School and everyone associated with it. The school's construction bonds had raised property taxes significantly throughout Bath Township, but for most residents, the sacrifice felt worthwhile. They could see their children receiving a quality education that would open doors previously closed to rural families. They took pride in their modern facility, in Superintendent Hike's progressive teaching methods, in the opportunity they were providing for the next generation. Andrew Kehoe saw only theft. His annual tax bill had risen to over $300, a substantial sum for a struggling farmer, but not unusual for a 185-acre property with a well-maintained home and outbuildings. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, however, this mandatory payment to support other people's children felt like a personal violation. He had no children of his own. Why should he subsidize the education of his neighbor's offspring? At school board meetings, Kehoe's complaints grew increasingly bitter and personal. While other board members discussed curriculum improvements or maintenance schedules, Kehoe fixated obsessively on expenses. He would arrive at meetings with detailed calculations, challenging every expenditure down to the cost of chalk and erasers. His face would flush with anger as he demanded explanations for perfectly routine educational expenses. Every dollar wasted on unnecessary frills is another dollar stolen from the pockets of hard-working farmers, he would declare, his voice rising to a near shout. Other board members began to dread these outbursts, but they attributed them to financial stress rather than recognizing the deeper psychological breakdown occurring before their eyes. Kehoe's resentment extended beyond mere numbers. He had convinced himself that Superintendent Hike was deliberately inflating costs and living luxuriously at taxpayers' expense. In Kehoe's twisted perception, Hike's modest salary and dignified manner became evidence of corruption and extravagance. He began spreading rumors throughout the community about alleged financial improprieties, though he could never provide evidence because none existed. The irony was bitter. While Kehoe complained about tax burdens, he was simultaneously borrowing money to maintain his farm's impressive appearance. His pride would not allow him to appear as anything less than prosperous, even as debts mounted beyond his ability to pay. He continued purchasing expensive farm equipment, maintained his property's immaculate condition, and presented himself as a successful landowner while privately seething about every tax dollar demanded from his emptying bank account. His wife Nellie bore the brunt of his escalating anger. As financial pressures mounted, His physical and emotional abuse intensified. She had grown thin and nervous, jumping at sudden sounds and carefully monitoring her husband's moods. Friends who tried to reach out to her were rebuffed. Kehoe had isolated her from potential support systems, ensuring that his rage had an available target whenever frustrations boiled over. By late 1926, Kehoe's behavior had become erratic enough that some community members began avoiding him altogether. His mechanical skills were still valuable, but his unpredictable temper made interactions uncomfortable and sometimes frightening. Parents warned their children to stay away from the Kehoe farm, though they couldn't articulate exactly why the man made them uneasy. The final straw came in March 1927, when Kehoe received notice that his mortgage payments were delinquent and foreclosure proceedings would begin unless he brought the account current immediately. The man who had spent years presenting himself as a successful farmer was facing public humiliation and financial ruin. His carefully constructed identity was crumbling, and he needed someone to blame. In Kehoe's diseased mind, the answer was obvious. The Bath Consolidated School had destroyed him. Superintendent Hike had stolen his money. The children who attended classes every day were living proof of his failure. And if he was going to lose everything he had worked for, if his life was effectively over, then perhaps it was time to ensure that others paid the price for his destruction. As spring arrived in Bath Township, Andrew Kehoe was no longer thinking about farming or community service or even his own survival. He was thinking about revenge and the perfect opportunity that his position as school treasurer provided for achieving it. The spring of 1927 brought Andrew Kehoe to the brink of complete psychological collapse. What had begun as financial stress had metastasized into something far more dangerous, a toxic combination of wounded pride, paranoid thinking, and homicidal rage that was transforming a respected community member into one of history's most calculating mass murderers. The foreclosure notice that arrived in March wasn't just a financial setback for Kehoe. It was a death sentence for his carefully constructed identity. For years, he had defined himself as a successful farmer, a man of substance and standing in Bath Township. His immaculate property, his mechanical expertise, his position on the school board. These weren't just accomplishments, they were armor against a world that he increasingly perceived as hostile and threatening. Now that armor was cracking, and the man underneath was far more fragile than anyone realized. Kehoe's reaction to impending financial ruin revealed the depth of his psychological instability. Rather than seeking help, negotiating with creditors, or making the practical adjustments that other struggling farmers were implementing, he retreated into a fantasy world where his problems were entirely the fault of others. The Bath Consolidated School wasn't just expensive. It was a conspiracy designed specifically to destroy him. Superintendent Hike wasn't just doing his job. He was a personal enemy who had orchestrated Kehoe's downfall. This paranoid thinking provided Kehoe with something his shattered ego desperately needed, a sense of purpose and power in the face of helplessness. If he was the victim of a conspiracy, then perhaps he could become its nemesis. If others had destroyed his life, then perhaps he could destroy theirs in return. The physical abuse of his wife, Nellie, escalated dramatically during this period. Neighbors later recalled hearing screams from the Kehoe farmhouse on multiple occasions, followed by days when Nellie would remain inside, allegedly suffering from falls or accidents that left her bruised and limping. The isolation she had endured for years became complete as Kehoe's paranoia extended to anyone who might provide her with support or escape. In his twisted logic, Nellie had become another symbol of his failures. Her family's money had helped him purchase the farm, making her a constant reminder of his dependence on others. Her quiet acceptance of his abuse fed his contempt rather than satisfying his need for dominance. She was simultaneously his victim and his judge, suffering his violence while serving as a witness to his inadequacy. Kehoe's behavior at school board meetings during this period alarmed even those accustomed to his outbursts. His complaints had evolved from specific grievances about expenditures to rambling accusations about corruption, conspiracy, and personal persecution. He would arrive at meetings with stacks of papers covered in obsessive calculations, attempting to prove that every dollar spent on education was somehow stolen directly from his pocket. "This school is bleeding this township dry," he declared at one particularly heated meeting, "and certain people are getting rich while honest farmers lose their homes." His eyes would fix on Superintendent Hike during these tirades, boring into the man with an intensity that made other board members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. But perhaps most chilling was Kehoe's newfound interest in the school building's infrastructure. As treasurer, he had legitimate reasons to inspect the facility, to understand its heating systems and electrical wiring. Yet his inspections had become obsessively detailed, focusing on areas where normal financial oversight wouldn't require such intimate knowledge. He spent hours in the school's basement, claiming to check on the furnace and electrical systems. He asked detailed questions about the building's structural supports, about which areas experienced the heaviest foot traffic, about the daily routines of teachers and students. To those who noticed, his curiosity seemed like the thoroughness of a dedicated treasurer. In reality, it was the reconnaissance of a man planning mass murder. Kehoe's mechanical expertise, once a source of community pride, had taken on a sinister dimension. His workshop filled with unusual chemicals and electrical components that had no obvious agricultural purpose. He ordered quantities of dynamite far beyond what any legitimate farming operation would require, claiming he was developing more efficient methods for clearing stumps and rocks. When neighbors asked about his experiments, Kehoe would deflect with technical explanations that sounded plausible but revealed nothing substantive. He had become secretive about his activities, working primarily at night and warning away anyone who ventured too close to his property. By late April 1927, Andrew Kehoe had crossed an invisible line from which there would be no return. His failures had become grievances, his grievances had become obsessions, and his obsessions had crystallized into a plan so monstrous that a healthy mind could never conceive it. He was no longer thinking about saving his farm or rebuilding his life. He was thinking about revenge, and he had identified the perfect target for his rage. What transformed Andrew Kehoe from an angry man into one of history's most calculating mass murderers was not a moment of sudden rage, but months of methodical planning that revealed the true depths of his psychological deterioration. From the fall of 1926 through the spring of 1927, while his neighbors saw a struggling farmer dealing with financial hardship, Kehoe was systematically preparing for an act of violence so comprehensive and devastating that it would forever change how America understood the threat of domestic terrorism. The Bath Consolidated School building became Kehoe's laboratory of death. His position as treasurer provided him with keys, access, and most importantly, a legitimate reason to be in the building during off hours when his activities wouldn't attract attention. What appeared to be routine maintenance visits were actually reconnaissance missions, as Kehoe mapped every corner of the structure and identified the most effective locations for maximum destruction. Working primarily in the early morning hours before classes began, Kehoe began installing his instruments of mass murder with the same meticulous precision he had once applied to farm machinery. He wired the school's basement with over 500 pounds of dynamite, carefully calculating the placement of each explosive device to ensure the complete collapse of the building's north wing. The work required extensive knowledge of structural engineering, electrical systems, and demolition techniques, knowledge that Kehoe had systematically acquired through months of research and experimentation. His workshop at home had become a bomb factory, filled with pyritol, dynamite, and various timing devices that he tested obsessively. Neighbors occasionally heard explosions from his property, but Kehoe always had ready explanations about clearing stumps or testing new agricultural techniques. In reality, he was perfecting the mechanisms that would soon kill dozens of innocent children. The psychological transformation occurring during these months was as systematic as his bomb-making. Kehoe had compartmentalized his consciousness, maintaining his public persona as a community member while secretly nurturing his identity as an agent of revenge. He attended school board meetings, participated in community functions, and maintained casual conversations with neighbors, all while planning their children's deaths. His treatment of his wife Nellie reached new levels of cruelty during this period. She had become not just a victim of his violence, but an unwilling witness to his preparations. The basement of their home filled with explosive materials, their barn contained stockpiles of ammunition and weapons, and their property became a fortress where Kehoe could work undisturbed on his instruments of mass destruction. Nellie's growing awareness of her husband's activities trapped her in a nightmare of complicity and terror. She knew something catastrophic was being planned, but years of abuse had conditioned her to silence and submission. Her few attempts to reach out to neighbors or family members were quickly discovered and brutally punished. Kehoe had effectively imprisoned her on their farm, ensuring that his secrets remained secure. The most chilling aspect of Kehoe's preparations was their comprehensive scope. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of terrorism designed to inflict maximum casualties and psychological trauma on the Bath Township community. He had identified the time of day when the school would be most crowded, calculated the most effective placement of explosives, and even planned multiple phases of attack to ensure that rescue efforts would be hampered by continued violence. His selection of targets revealed the depth of his hatred. The north wing of the school housed the youngest children, kindergarten through third grade, ensuring that his victims would be the most innocent and defenseless members of the community. He had calculated that the explosion would occur during morning classes when the building would be at its maximum capacity, guaranteeing the highest possible death toll. Kehoe's final preparations in the weeks leading up to May 18th demonstrated an almost supernatural level of planning and foresight. He arranged his farm as a secondary crime scene, wiring his buildings with explosives and incendiary devices designed to destroy evidence and create additional chaos. He had anticipated that investigators would eventually focus on his property, and he was determined to leave nothing behind that might provide answers or closure to survivors. Perhaps most disturbing was his ability to maintain normal relationships during this period. Teachers at the school continued to regard him as a helpful treasurer who took his responsibilities seriously. Fellow school board members appreciated his attention to detail and financial oversight. Neighbors still viewed him as a skilled mechanic who could solve technical problems that baffled others. This facade of normalcy wasn't accidental. It was a carefully maintained deception that allowed Kehoe to continue his preparations without arousing suspicion. He had become a master of psychological manipulation, presenting whatever persona was necessary to gain access, deflect questions, or maintain his cover. By early May 1927, Andrew Kehoe's transformation was complete. The respected farmer and community leader had become a terrorist whose capacity for calculated violence would soon shock the nation. His preparations were finished, his targets were selected, and his timeline was established. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to unleash the horror he had so methodically created. Dawn broke clear and beautiful over Bath Township on May 18, 1927, the kind of perfect spring morning that made farmers grateful for their chosen life and parents proud to send their children off to school. The temperature held steady in the comfortable 60s, with a gentle breeze carrying the sweet scents of apple blossoms and fresh-cut hay across the countryside. It should have been a day like any other in this peaceful farming community. Instead, it would become the date forever seared into American memory as the day innocence died in a small Michigan town. At the Bath Consolidated School, the morning routine unfolded with its usual rhythm. Children arrived by horse-drawn wagon, on foot, and in the few family automobiles that served the more prosperous farming families. Their voices filled the spring air with laughter and chatter as they gathered on the school grounds before the first bell. Some played marbles in the dirt, others skipped rope or engaged in impromptu games of tag. The youngest students clung to lunch pails packed by loving mothers, while older children helped herd the little ones toward their appropriate classroom entrances. Superintendent Emery Hike stood in the school's main hallway, greeting students and teachers as they arrived. At 54 years old, he embodied everything admirable about rural American education: dedicated, principled, genuinely caring about every child in his charge. This morning, he was particularly pleased because the school was hosting its annual spring pageant later that week, and rehearsals were progressing beautifully. The building buzzed with excited energy that came near the end of the academic year. Teachers filed into their classrooms, arranging lessons and reviewing the day's plans. In the north wing, where the youngest children attended classes, Miss Bernice Sterling prepared her first-grade room with the special attention that the smallest students required. Colorful drawings decorated the walls, alphabet cards hung neatly above the blackboard, and small desks sat arranged in neat rows, waiting for their occupants. None of them knew that Andrew Kehoe had been in the building just hours earlier, making his final preparations. Kehoe had arrived at the school around 5:30 a.m., using his treasurer's key to enter the building while the community still slept. Moving with the practiced efficiency of months of planning, he had armed the timing devices connected to his carefully placed explosives. Everything was now synchronized to detonate at precisely 9:45 a.m., a time he had calculated would ensure maximum casualties among the youngest and most vulnerable students. From the school, Kehoe had returned to his farm to complete the final phase of his plan. His property had been transformed into a secondary crime scene, with explosives wired throughout the buildings and incendiary devices designed to destroy evidence. But first, there was one more piece of business to complete: the murder of his wife Nellie. The woman who had endured years of escalating abuse would not survive to see the horror her husband was about to unleash. Sometime between 7 o'clock and 8 a.m., Andrew Kehoe killed his wife. The exact method would remain unclear due to the destruction that followed, but her death was brutal and final. She became the first victim of May 18th, murdered in the farmhouse where she had suffered in silence for years. As children filled their classrooms and teachers began morning lessons, Kehoe methodically prepared for the grand finale of his revenge fantasy. He loaded his truck with additional explosives, weapons, and metal objects that would serve as deadly shrapnel. Then he set fire to his farm buildings, watching with cold satisfaction as smoke began rising into the perfect spring sky. At 9:30 a.m., the Bath Consolidated School was operating at peak capacity. Approximately 314 students filled the building, ranging from 5-year-old kindergartners in the North Wing to 18-year-old seniors preparing for graduation. Teachers moved through their morning lessons, completely unaware that beneath their feet, timing devices were counting down the final minutes before catastrophe. In the North Wing, where Kehoe had concentrated his deadliest explosives, 38 children sat at their desks, focused on their lessons and thinking about lunch, recess, and the promise of another beautiful spring afternoon. Their teacher smiled as she guided them through reading exercises, proud of their progress and optimistic about their futures. The clock on the school's tower read 9:44 a.m. In 60 seconds, Andrew Kehoe's months of methodical planning would transform this scene of educational tranquility into America's deadliest school massacre. The children of Bath Township had less than 1 minute left in the world they had always known, a world where schools were safe spaces, where trusted adults protected rather than threatened them, and where the most dangerous thing they might encounter was a playground disagreement. At 9:45 a.m., that world would end forever. At exactly 9:45 a.m., Andrew Kehoe's months of methodical planning culminated in a moment of unimaginable horror. The north wing of the Bath Consolidated School simply vanished in a thunderous explosion that could be heard for miles across the peaceful farming countryside. Over 500 pounds of dynamite detonated simultaneously beneath the classrooms, where the youngest children sat at their desks, transforming a symbol of educational progress into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted the entire north section of the building into the air before dropping it back as a pile of twisted metal, shattered brick, and splintered wood. The two-story structure collapsed instantly, crushing everything and everyone inside beneath tons of debris. Children who had been reciting their lessons just moments before were buried alive under the wreckage of their own school. The sound was unlike anything the residents of Bath Township had ever experienced. A deep, earth-shaking roar that rattled windows for miles and sent birds fleeing from every tree in the vicinity. Farmers working their fields looked up in shock as the concussion wave rolled across the landscape like thunder from a clear sky. In the village, dishes fell from shelves and children began crying from the sheer terror of the noise. At the school, the immediate aftermath was chaos beyond description. The south wing of the building remained partially intact, but it was filled with smoke, dust, and the screams of children and teachers who had survived the initial blast, but were trapped in damaged classrooms. Glass from shattered windows had turned into deadly projectiles, slicing through the air and embedding in walls, furniture, and human flesh. Superintendent Emery Hike had been in his office when the explosion occurred. The blast threw him against the far wall, leaving him dazed and bleeding but conscious. As the ringing in his ears subsided, he became aware of sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cries of injured children, the groans of twisted metal, and underneath it all, An ominous silence from the north wing, where the youngest students had been attending their morning lessons. The teachers who survived the initial explosion immediately began organizing rescue efforts, despite their own injuries and shock. Miss Bernice Sterling, who had been teaching first grade in the devastated north wing, was nowhere to be found, buried somewhere beneath the tons of debris that had once been her classroom. Other educators, bleeding from glass cuts and struggling with their own trauma, began pulling children from the wreckage with their bare hands. Within minutes of the explosion, the entire community began converging on the school. Farmers abandoned their plows in the middle of fields. Mothers ran from their kitchens without stopping to remove their aprons, and anyone who could walk began racing toward the column of smoke and dust rising from what had been their pride and joy just moments before. The scene that greeted these first responders was apocalyptic. Where the north wing had stood, there was now only a crater filled with debris and death. Pieces of children's desks were scattered across the schoolyard. Fragments of textbooks and school supplies lay mixed with chunks of concrete and twisted metal. And everywhere, the sound of voices calling out names, parents screaming for their children, teachers trying to account for missing students, neighbors desperately searching for any sign of life beneath the rubble. The rescue efforts were hampered by the complete destruction of the north wing and the instability of the remaining structure. Every attempt to dig into the debris risked causing further collapse that could kill additional victims or rescuers. Men used their bare hands, shovels, and anything else they could find to move the massive chunks of concrete and steel, working frantically against time and the growing realization that many of the children buried beneath were beyond help. Among the first rescuers was Dr. J. Crum, Bath Township's physician, who had heard the explosion from his office and immediately grabbed his medical bag. What he found exceeded his worst nightmares. Children with limbs severed by flying debris, teachers with glass embedded in their faces and torsos, and underneath the rubble, bodies so mangled that identification would require the most intimate knowledge of clothing, jewelry, or other personal effects. As word of the explosion spread beyond Bath Township, help began arriving from surrounding communities. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers came from Lansing, Jackson, and Grand Rapids, but the scale of the casualties and the remote location of the school made coordinating effective medical response nearly impossible. Many of the most severely injured died before they could receive proper medical attention. The explosion had claimed 38 victims in an instant, 37 children and one teacher, Miss Bernice Sterling, who died trying to protect her first-grade students. But Andrew Kehoe's revenge was not yet complete. Even as rescue workers pulled broken bodies from the wreckage and parents searched desperately for their children, the man responsible for this carnage was preparing for the final act of his monstrous plan. The worst was yet to come. As rescue workers frantically dug through the rubble of the destroyed north wing and parents searched desperately for their children among the casualties, Andrew Kehoe was methodically preparing for the final phase of his revenge. The school explosion had been merely the opening act of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror designed to inflict maximum trauma on the Bath Township community. What happened next would demonstrate the true depths of his calculated malice and forever change how America understood the threat posed by domestic terrorists. Around 10:30 a.m., approximately 45 minutes after the initial explosion, Kehoe loaded his pickup truck with additional explosives, metal debris that would serve as deadly shrapnel, and various weapons. His farm buildings were already ablaze. He had set them on fire to destroy evidence and create additional chaos for investigators. Smoke from his property rose into the spring sky like a funeral pyre, visible for miles across the countryside. Kehoe then drove toward the school, where the entire community had gathered for rescue operations. His timing was calculated with the same precision he had applied to every other aspect of his plan. He knew that Superintendent Emery Hike would be coordinating rescue efforts, that parents would be clustered around the building waiting for news of their children, and that first responders would be focused on the immediate crisis rather than watching for additional threats. As Kehoe's truck approached the school grounds, several people recognized him and assumed he was arriving to help with rescue efforts. After all, as school treasurer and a respected community member, his presence at this tragedy would be both natural and welcome. No one suspected that the man they trusted was actually responsible for the horror they were experiencing. Superintendent Hike spotted Kehoe's truck and walked toward it, perhaps hoping that the treasurer might have information about building plans or structural details that could aid in the rescue efforts. Hike was bloodied and exhausted from his efforts to coordinate the emergency response, but he maintained his characteristic dignity and focus on helping others, despite his own trauma. Other community members gathered around the truck as well, parents desperate for any news about their children, neighbors who had come to help with rescue operations, and local officials trying to make sense of the catastrophe that had befallen their peaceful township. They had no way of knowing they were walking directly into the final trap set by the man who had orchestrated their nightmare. What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses would struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. Kehoe apparently summoned Superintendent Hike to his truck, possibly claiming to have information about additional explosives or structural damage. As Hike approached, Kehoe detonated a massive bomb he had rigged in the truck bed, a device packed with dynamite and metal shrapnel designed to kill everyone within a significant radius. The secondary explosion was smaller than the school blast, but far more personally devastating to the rescue efforts. Superintendent Hike was killed instantly, along with several other community members who had gathered around the truck. The man who had dedicated his life to educating Bath Township's children died trying to save them, becoming the final victim of Andrew Kehoe's calculated revenge. Kehoe himself was obliterated in the blast he had triggered, ending his own life in the same moment he claimed his final victims. His death was not an accident or a moment of suicidal despair. It was the planned culmination of his revenge fantasy. He had intended from the beginning to die in his attack, ensuring that he could never be captured, tried, or forced to explain his actions. The truck explosion claimed 8 additional lives, including Kehoe himself, bringing the total death toll to 45 people. Among the dead were Nelson McFarren, who had been helping coordinate rescue efforts, Glenn Smith, a local resident who had rushed to help, and several other community members whose only crime had been caring enough about their neighbors' children to volunteer for dangerous rescue work. The psychological impact of this second explosion on the survivors was devastating. The realization that someone they had trusted, a man who had keys to their children's school and access to their most precious spaces, had orchestrated this entire nightmare, shattered their fundamental assumptions about safety, community, and human nature. If Andrew Kehoe could plan and execute such an attack, who else might be harboring similar intentions? In the smoking crater where Kehoe's truck had been, investigators later found a wooden sign that he had apparently prepared in advance. Hand-painted in neat letters were the words, "Criminals are made, not born." Even in death, Kehoe was attempting to justify his actions by portraying himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. But nothing could justify what he had done. Nothing could explain how a man could spend months planning the murder of children, could look into the faces of students and teachers while secretly preparing their deaths, could transform a symbol of educational progress into a tomb of innocence. The sign was simply the final expression of a mind so twisted by resentment and self-pity that it had lost all connection to basic human decency. As the second plume of smoke rose from the school grounds, Bath Township faced a new reality. Their children were dead, their school was destroyed, their sense of security was shattered, and the man responsible had taken his secrets with him to the grave. In the immediate aftermath of Andrew Kehoe's calculated massacre, Bath Township resembled a war zone more than a peaceful farming community. 45 people lay dead, 38 of them children whose only crime had been attending school on a beautiful spring morning. The Bath Consolidated School, once a symbol of educational progress and community pride, stood as a smoking ruin that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The scale of the tragedy overwhelmed the small community's ability to comprehend or respond. Entire families had been wiped out in a single morning. The Hart family lost their daughter Iola. The Hart family mourned young Carlisle. The McFarren family grieved for little Thelma. Name after name on the casualty list represented not just individual deaths, but the destruction of dreams, the shattering of families, and the theft of futures that would never unfold. Among the adult victims, the loss of Superintendent Emery Hike proved particularly devastating to the community's recovery efforts. Hike had been more than an educator. He had been the moral center of Bath Township's educational mission, a man whose vision and dedication had transformed scattered rural schools into a unified system that promised better opportunities for local children. His death and Kehoe's final explosion seemed to symbolize the murder of hope itself. The investigation into Kehoe's motives revealed the disturbing extent of his planning and the depth of his psychological deterioration. Searchers combing through the ruins of his farm found evidence of months of preparation, including used explosives that suggested the attack could have been even more devastating. They discovered that Kehoe had wired additional bombs throughout the school that had failed to detonate, a malfunction that likely saved dozens of additional lives. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Kehoe's meticulous planning documents, which revealed that he had considered multiple attack scenarios and had chosen the method designed to inflict maximum casualties on the youngest children. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of mental breakdown. It was a calculated campaign of terrorism executed with the precision of a military operation. The community's response to the tragedy revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Neighbors who had feuded over property lines or political differences came together to support grieving families. Farmers who could barely afford their own expenses donated money, food, and labor to help survivors. Churches opened their doors for funeral services that seemed to stretch on endlessly through the weeks following the massacre. Yet the trauma also created lasting divisions and suspicions. Parents who had once trusted their children's safety to community institutions now questioned everything and everyone. The easy familiarity of small-town life was replaced by a wariness that would persist for generations. Children who survived the attack carried both physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Media coverage of the Bath school disaster was extensive in 1927, but competed with other major news stories of the era, including Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight just 2 days after the massacre. This timing proved unfortunately prophetic. While Lindbergh's achievement represented the triumph of human ingenuity and courage, the Bath tragedy demonstrated humanity's capacity for calculated evil. History chose to remember the hero while gradually forgetting the victims. The decision to rebuild the school became a source of controversy that divided the community for years. Some residents argued that the site should be preserved as a memorial to the victims. Others insisted that the best tribute to the dead children would be to create a new educational facility that would serve future generations. Eventually, a smaller replacement school was constructed, but the community never fully recovered its earlier optimism about progress and modernity. The psychological impact of Kehoe's attack extended far beyond Bath Township. This was 1927, an era when Americans still believed in the fundamental goodness of their neighbors, when schools were considered sanctuaries, and when the idea of domestic terrorism was virtually inconceivable. The Bath school disaster shattered these assumptions and introduced concepts that wouldn't become commonplace in American discourse for decades. The insider threat, the calculated mass murderer, the vulnerability of educational institutions. Kehoe's attack also established a template that would be followed by future school attackers. The methodical planning, the targeting of defenseless victims, the desire to inflict maximum psychological trauma on a community. All of these elements would reappear in later tragedies. In a very real sense, Andrew Kehoe was the first modern school shooter, even though his weapon of choice was explosives rather than firearms. Today, the Bath school disaster remains America's deadliest school attack, yet has been largely forgotten by the general public. No major motion pictures have dramatized the tragedy. No best-selling books have brought the victim stories to contemporary audiences. The massacre that should serve as a crucial lesson about the vulnerability of our educational institutions and the dangers of domestic terrorism has instead become a historical footnote. This forgetting represents a tragedy almost as profound as the original attack. The children who died in Bath Township deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives had meaning and whose deaths should inform our ongoing efforts to protect future generations. Their stories remind us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that our most trusted institutions remain vulnerable to those who would exploit our trust, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.